Rayleigh looked down at the dark purple bruise on her arm, her fingers trembling as the cold realization settled in. The house she had spent 40 years building, the place where she had raised a family and tucked her children into bed, had quietly become a prison without bars. Her son, always so consumed by the demands of his own life, had no idea that the lie he told, the story about his mother suffering from a severe illness, was actually the first stitch in a betrayal that would eventually tear her whole world apart. Hello, everyone. I am Casey. It is truly good to be back here with you in this little corner of ours. Today, I am bringing you the story of a woman named Rayleigh. To be honest, when I first started putting these words together, I had to pause for a long time just to sit with the weight of it. I kept thinking, is there any pain deeper than feeling like a stranger in your own house? The very place you poured your soul into for a lifetime. Let us lean in and listen to Rayleigh as she shares her journey with us. I can still remember the exact air of that morning in North Carolina. It had that specific scent of damp wood and the restless rustling of maple leaves in the garden. It was a morning that should have felt like 1,000 others since my husband passed away, but there was a weight to it that I could not quite shake off. It felt like a storm was gathering somewhere far off behind those heavy gray clouds, just waiting for the right moment to break and change everything I thought I knew about my life. I woke up at 6 o'clock sharp. It is the kind of habit a person builds over a lifetime of never allowing herself to be lazy, even when there is nothing left to rush for. My bedroom is tucked away at the very end of the hallway now, in a corner where the morning sun has a hard time reaching, as if the house itself is trying to keep me in the shadows. I slid my feet into my old Skechers, and the familiar softness of the soles felt like a small, rare comfort against the cold floor. When I made my way down to the kitchen, the house felt cavernous. I brewed myself a pot of wheat coffee and toasted a single slice of bread with a bit of strawberry jam. The sound of the toaster popping up was so sharp and dry in the absolute silence of the kitchen. I sat down at the table where Colin and Karen used to sit with me every morning, but now I was just facing a row of empty chairs. I found myself talking to the little herb pots on the windowsill, asking them if they had slept well, mostly just to hear the sound of my own voice. I needed to hear it just to be sure that I was still here, still a part of this world. I looked out the window at the backyard and noticed the soil was starting to look parched, and the flower beds were thinning. A small spark of hope flickered in my chest, thinking of the life I could bring back to the dirt. When Karen finally came down the stairs, her eyes glued to her new iPhone, I gathered enough courage to speak up. I told her the weather was supposed to be nice this weekend and asked if the family wanted to head out to the garden to plant a few new rose bushes. I told her I thought the grandkids would love to help. She did not even look up at me. She just gave a dismissive shrug and said that nobody does that anymore because it is just dirty and exhausting work. She told me I should just use that time to rest. Before I could say another word, she clicked on the giant flat-screen TV in the living room. The loud, piercing noise of some reality show filled every corner of the house, completely swallowing my presence. I felt myself shrinking, so I walked back to my room, hoping to look at the wedding photo of Frank and me to find a bit of peace. But when I pushed the door open, my heart dropped. My nightstand was empty. The only black and white photo I had cherished for decades, the one of us on the day we started our life together, was gone. Karen followed me in with a strange, bright smile, telling me she had just tidied things up for me. She said those old things just collect dust and make the place look cluttered and messy. She told me the room looked so much more modern now, as if that was supposed to make me happy. I just stood there in the middle of that modern, empty room, feeling like a piece of my soul had been stolen. I did not recognize my home anymore, and it felt like my home did not want to hold on to me either. I sat quietly on the edge of my bed, my thin fingers laced tightly together in my lap. This modern room that Karen had just rearranged felt so incredibly foreign to me, like a sterile hotel room that lacked any trace of a soul. Without Frank's photo there to greet me, I felt like a boat that had finally slipped its moorings, drifting aimlessly into a tide of memories that felt both sweet and devastating at the same time. I closed my eyes and let myself go back to the way things used to be. I remember the 1980s so clearly, back when I worked as a librarian at the town library, and Frank spent his days covered in sawdust at his woodworking shop. We saved every single penny from our modest paychecks just to buy this patch of land. I can still smell the scent of fresh-cut pine and hear the sound of Colin's little feet thumping across the floors before we even had a chance to paint them. Back then, I was the heart of this house. I was the one who kept the fire burning and the one who made every decision, from the color of the curtains to where the children went to school. Frank used to take my hand and tell me that I was the very soul of everything we built. When he passed away, I didn't hesitate for a second. I took every bit of the insurance money and my entire retirement savings to help Colin buy this house from his siblings. My only wish was to spend my final years surrounded by the people I loved most. I truly believed that my sacrifice was a seed that would grow into a lifetime of family happiness. But I was so wrong. The reality of my new life hit me like a physical blow during dinner that evening. I waited for a quiet moment and then tentatively brought up an idea I had been thinking about for weeks. I told them I had seen a book club at the church and that I wanted to use a little bit of my own pension money to join. I told them the fees were small and the books wouldn't cost much at all. Colin, my own son, the boy I used to stay up with all night when he had a fever, didn't even look up from his plate of mashed potatoes. He just let his fork drop with a hollow clatter against the ceramic and let out a long, heavy sigh. Karen jumped in immediately, her voice sounding so sweet, it made my skin crawl. She told me she knew how much I loved books, but then she started listing off the rising costs of the kids' after-school activities and the car insurance. She made sure to mention how Colin had been working overtime all week just to keep us afloat. Colin finally nodded, though he still wouldn't meet my eyes, and told me he didn't want to stop me, but that the family needed everyone to pull their weight right now. That unfinished sentence felt like a judge passing a sentence on my life. They had taken a small, rightful wish of mine, something I wanted to pay for with my own hard-earned money, and turned it into a moral burden. I realized right then that my position in this house had completely shifted. I was no longer the owner or the matriarch. I was an uninvited guest, an overdue debt that they were forced to carry. All of Karen's forced kindness was just a thin veil covering the fact that she was systematically stripping away my control over my money and my own life. I felt my chest tighten as a quiet, steady anger began to burn deep inside me. I hadn't just lost my husband's photograph. I was losing my very voice in the home I built with my own sweat and tears. I tossed and turned for hours after that dinner, my mind racing while the muffled roar of the television from the living room drowned out the soft whistle of the wind through the window cracks. I knew right then that I couldn't just stay quiet and let myself fade away. I needed to breathe, to hear the voice of a friend, and to feel like I was still a part of this community instead of just some old piece of furniture pushed into a dusty corner of a warehouse. The next morning, while Karen was busy rummaging around in the garage, I saw my chance and quietly made my way to the living room. I was thinking of Helen, my best friend from our days at the church ladies' auxiliary. I picked up the landline receiver, my fingertips trembling slightly as I pressed the familiar buttons. I told myself that if I could just hear Helen's voice, everything might start to feel a little more normal again. But before the second ring could even finish, a hand with a perfectly manicured set of nails pressed down on the hook, cutting the line dead. Karen was standing right there, wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes anymore. She asked me who I was trying to call and reminded me that the doctor said I needed absolute rest. I tried to explain that I just wanted to say hello to Helen, but Karen gently took the phone from my hand and put it back on the base. She picked it up herself and spoke into it, telling Helen that I was a bit tired and had been quite forgetful lately, so it wasn't a good time for me to come to the phone or go out. Every word she spoke felt like another brick in the wall she was building around me. She was painting a picture of a senile, sick old woman to the only friends I had left. The feeling of being trapped made me want to get out, even just for a short walk. I went to the corner by the door to find the wooden cane Frank had carved for me with his own hands. It was the only thing that made my weak legs feel steady, but the spot was empty. I searched the closet and looked under the bed, my heart thumping against my ribs in a panic. Karen walked in then, holding a glass of orange juice. She asked if I was looking for that old cane and told me it was all scratched up, so she had moved it to the attic so it could be refinished later. She told me from now on I should just call her whenever I wanted to go somewhere so she could take me safely. She said the stairs were dangerous and she worried so much about me. She said it with so much concern, but I knew exactly what it meant. She had taken away my legs and forced me to depend entirely on her schedule and her mercy. I sat down on the chair and looked at my hands, which were shaking not from old age, but from sheer helplessness. I felt like a child being punished and confined to my room in the very house I had spent my life building. Have you ever felt concern turn into invisible chains? Rayleigh is losing simple freedoms. A call to a friend, a step on her own. How would you feel in her place? Can overprotection become emotional abuse? Share your thoughts. And today, check in on the seniors in your life. A quick call can feel like freedom. That night, I lay in the pitch black of my bedroom, the air still and heavy like it was waiting for something to break. Without the wooden cane Frank had carved for me to lean on, my legs throbbed with a dull, persistent ache every time I tried to shift my weight. Karen's voice kept echoing in my head, that sweet, poisonous tone she used when she told me she was putting my cane away for my own safety. It was a lie, and I knew it now. It wasn't a safety measure. It was a tether, an invisible rope tying me to this bed, turning me into a prisoner in the very home I had spent decades making beautiful. I stared up at the ceiling, watching the faint shadows of the maple trees outside dance in the moonlight, counting the rhythmic ticks of the wall clock. Each second felt like a piece of my life slipping away, leaving me behind like a ruin crumbling in the North Carolina dirt. Lately, every single meal at that dining table had become harder to swallow than the physical pain in my joints. Karen made sure of that. She had this habit of sighing loudly over the grocery receipts from Walmart or Harris Teeter, pacing back and forth with a calculated look of distress on her face. She would wave those long strips of paper around, complaining about how inflation was spiraling out of control and how Colin's paycheck could barely keep up with the cost of a gallon of milk. She would look right at me and ask if I had any idea how much things cost these days. Then she'd remind me that I shouldn't be asking for luxury items like my gardening magazines or new books when the family was struggling just to put bread on the table. I would just hang my head. feeling this crushing weight of guilt in my chest. I actually believed her. I believed I was a burden, a drain on their resources, and that my modest pension was nothing compared to the high cost of living in America today. I spent weeks cutting back on everything, denying myself the smallest joys, just so my son wouldn't feel the pressure. But I had no idea that while I was counting pennies, a much darker, more expensive game was being played right under my nose. It was almost 1 a.m. when the silence of the house was shattered. My iPad, sitting on the nightstand, suddenly flared to life, its bright screen cutting through the dark like a blade. The FaceTime ringtone was urgent, echoing off the walls. It was Michael, my youngest. He is a Navy officer, stationed thousands of miles away in Naples, Italy. My heart started racing as I fumbled for the device, my hands shaking. When his face finally appeared, I could see the shimmering lights of a European naval port in the background, but his expression was nothing like the cheerful one he usually wore. He looked pale and confused, his eyes darting around as he lowered his voice to a whisper. He asked if I was there and told me he had seen something so strange he wasn't even sure if he should tell me. I felt a chill run down my spine as I asked him what was wrong. Michael took a deep breath and told me he had been at a high-end jewelry boutique in the center of Naples earlier that evening. He swore to me that he saw Karen there. He said she was with an older man, someone dressed in a very expensive suit. He watched from across the shop as the man personally fastened a thick gold bracelet onto Karen's wrist. Michael said they looked intimate, the kind of closeness you only see between people who are more than just friends. He told me he was about to go over and say something, but they stepped out and disappeared into a waiting limousine before he could reach them. My world felt like it was tilting on its axis. Karen in Italy, with another man, all while she was telling me we were too broke to buy roses for the garden and that she had to stay home to manage the household expenses. Before I could even process the shock, I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. Colin, my eldest, must have been woken up by the ringing. He pushed the door open, his face looking haggard and worn out from lack of sleep. When he saw I was on a call, he asked if that was Michael and reached for the iPad. He spoke to his brother with a voice that was thick with sleep, but full of a strange kind of pride. He told Michael that things were a bit rough at home because I had fallen severely ill and had been bedridden for days. Then he said how lucky we were to have Karen, claiming she was downstairs in the kitchen right then, making porridge for me. He told Michael that she was exhausted from staying up all night to nurse me back to health, and that she hadn't left my side for a second. I sat there in total, paralyzed silence. My ears were ringing so loudly, I could barely hear the rest of their conversation. It was the most perfect, most cold-blooded double lie I had ever heard in my life. Colin actually believed his wife was in the kitchen being a saint, a story Karen had clearly invented so she could fly across the world and live a life of luxury with someone else using the very money she had squeezed out of this family. And there I was, physically capable but mentally shattered, being used as a prop in her twisted script. Michael looked at me through the screen, his eyes filled with a mix of horror and sudden understanding. He started to say something, but I quickly signaled for him to stay quiet. I couldn't let Colin know the truth yet. I needed to breathe. I needed to let this disgusting reality sink in. After Colin handed the tablet back and wandered out of the room, Michael whispered with a voice that was trembling with pure rage. He asked me if I was really sick, and when I shook my head, he told me that woman was deceiving every single one of us. He told me I had to be careful and promised he would find a way to get home as soon as he possibly could. When the call ended, I sat there in the dark of the North Carolina countryside, realizing I was trapped inside a trashy, low-budget play. Karen hadn't just taken my freedom. She was stomping on my son's love and the very dignity of our family. The ache in my leg seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold, steady fire that began to burn in my chest. I realized right then that I couldn't be the weak old woman waiting to die anymore. Not today. Not ever again. I didn't sleep at all that night. The chill from the hardwood floor seemed to seep into my very bones, a coldness that no blanket could ever touch. Michael's voice telling me about the gold bracelet in Italy, and Colin's blatant lie about me being severely ill kept spinning in my head like a carousel that wouldn't stop. I felt like a fish out of water, gasping for one last breath of truth before being completely swallowed by a tidal wave of deception. Every tick of the clock was a reminder that the world I thought I knew was nothing more than a carefully constructed stage. The next morning, Karen floated into my room carrying a tray of porridge and several orange bottles of medication from the local CVS. She was still wearing those expensive silk pajamas, the kind I had never even thought to ask where the money came from. She set the tray down with a soft click, her voice sounding sweet enough to rot my teeth, but her eyes were like two pieces of flint. She asked if I was finally awake and told me I had been delirious again last night, claiming I had called Michael and made him very worried. She said he had actually sent them an angry text because of whatever I had babbled to him in my fever. I looked at her, my hands shaking so hard the sheets rustled, and I told her Michael saw her in Naples with another man. Karen didn't even flinch. She just let out a small, pitying laugh and told me my condition was clearly worse than she feared. She mentioned how inflation had driven up the cost of my specialized medicine and how she was working so hard to keep me comfortable, only for me to start having these paranoid delusions. Just as she was speaking, Colin walked through the door. Seeing me so agitated, he let out a long, heavy sigh and placed his hand on Karen's shoulder in a gesture of pure protection. I looked at my son, my own flesh and blood, desperate to find even a flicker of the boy I raised. I begged him to believe me, telling him I wasn't sick and that Karen was lying to him about where she had been. Colin wouldn't even look me in the eye. He just stared at the bottles of medicine on the table and then looked at his wife with such gratitude it made me want to scream. He told me that Karen had stayed up all night for me and that he had seen her preparing my medicine at midnight with his own eyes. He told me not to let my dreams or hallucinations from the medication turn me against the woman who was sacrificing everything for this family. He said Karen had been through enough already. My ears began to ring, a high-pitched sound that drowned out the rest of his words. I realized then that Karen had calculated every single move. She knew Colin was exhausted and that he would choose the easy lie over the painful truth. She had successfully turned my clarity into a symptom of a disease and Michael's testimony into a hallucination. As they turned to leave, Karen looked back at me one last time. The mask of the gentle caregiver was gone, replaced by a sharp, triumphant smile. She pulled the door shut, and I heard the unmistakable click of the lock from the outside. That sound was like the heavy stone of a tomb being slid into place. I sat there in the dim light of my room, realizing that the son I had carried and nurtured had completely abandoned his faith in me. I wasn't just being ignored by the world anymore. I was being erased from the heart of the one person I loved most. The metallic click of the lock that afternoon was like the final strike of a hammer driving a nail into the coffin of my spirit. I sat perfectly still in my old armchair, my eyes fixed on nothing as I stared out the window. Outside, the maple trees that defined our little corner of North Carolina were erupting in brilliant shades of crimson and burnt orange. a fire of autumn life against the cooling sky. But inside this room, everything had faded into a dull, suffocating gray. I found that I couldn't even cry anymore. The pain of having my own son refuse to believe me had dried up every tear I had left. It is a strange thing, how the heart can feel both heavy as lead and completely empty at the exact same time. For the next 2 days, I was kept in that small space under the pretense of resting for my health. Karen would bring up my meals, but they were nothing more than cans of cheap soup from Walmart, heated up in a hurry and served lukewarm. The broth was thin and salty, tasting more like the tin can it came from than anything real. She wouldn't even look at me when she set the tray down. She would just turn around and walk out, never forgetting to check that the door was pulled tight and the lock was engaged. I would sit there listening to the muffled sounds of the house below. I heard Colin come home from work, his voice booming with a tired but happy greeting. I heard the grandkids laughing and running across the hardwood floors. A few times, I walked to the door and raised my hand to pound on it, to scream for someone to let me out. But then my hand would just drop to my side. What was the point? Colin already believed I was a paranoid old woman losing her grip on reality. The silence of that house was far more terrifying than any shouting match could ever be. It began to eat away at my self-respect, making me wonder if Karen was right. Maybe I was just confused. Maybe my mind was finally failing me. By the third day, the door finally opened. Karen told me that someone from the church had come to visit and that I was to come down to the living room. But before she let me pass, she grabbed my upper arm. Her grip was tight, her manicured nails digging deep into my skin through the thin fabric of my blouse. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint, and whispered that I had better behave myself. She told me not to make things difficult for Colin anymore. The sharp sting of her grip made me flinch, but I didn't say a word. I went into the bathroom first to splash some cold water on my face. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, I looked like a ghost of the woman I used to be. I pulled up my sleeve and there it was. A deep, mottled bruise, the size of a hand, blooming in shades of sickly purple and yellow on my pale skin. It was from where she had shoved me against the wall the night before. Looking at that mark, I felt a sudden surge of disgust, not for her, but for my own silence. This wasn't love or care. This was a cruel invasion of the very last thing I had left, my human dignity. The doorbell rang, and Karen's demeanor shifted instantly. She opened the door with a bright, welcoming smile, greeting Anna, a young volunteer from our community church. Anna had been coming to see me every Wednesday for months, bringing homemade treats and sitting with me to read the Bible. Today, she was carrying a loaf of banana bread that was still warm, the scent of cinnamon and sugar filling the cold corners of the living room. It was the first thing that had smelled like home in weeks. Anna didn't rush over. She set her basket down and walked toward me, sitting right on the rug at my feet. She looked up at me and asked how I was doing, noting that I looked a bit pale. Karen stayed right there, her arms crossed over her chest, jumping in to say that I had been forgetful and wasn't eating much lately. Anna didn't look at Karen. She kept her focus on me, reaching out to hold my trembling hands in hers. Her eyes were warm like the afternoon sun, filled with a look that had no judgment or pity, only a deep, quiet sincerity. She asked if I would like some hot tea and offered to go into the kitchen to make a pot for us. When Karen got distracted by her phone ringing in the kitchen, Anna leaned in close to my ear. She whispered my name and asked me what was really happening. She told me not to be afraid because she was right there with me. My lips started to tremble as I looked at her. I was about to say I was fine, just to keep the peace. But then Anna accidentally brushed against my bruised arm. I couldn't help the small groan of pain that escaped my throat. She noticed immediately. She gently eased my sleeve up, and when she saw the dark bruise on my skin, her eyes widened in shock. She didn't scream or make a scene. She took a deep, steadying breath and squeezed my hand even tighter. She told me that I wasn't alone, that God hadn't abandoned me, and neither would she. For the first time in so many days, I felt like I was being seen. I felt like a real person again, not just a burden or a problem to be solved. The frustration I had been holding back finally broke through. I whispered to her that I wasn't crazy. I told her that Michael had seen Karen in Italy, but that no one in the house would believe a word I said. Anna nodded at me with a firm, steady look that carried more strength than an entire army. She didn't ask a dozen questions. She just reached into her bag, scribbled a number on a small scrap of paper, and tucked it deep into my pocket. She told me it was her personal cell phone number and told me to call her no matter what, as soon as Karen left the house. Karen came back into the room then, her face once again wearing that mask of the perfect daughter-in-law. Anna stood up and said her goodbyes, giving me a long, tight hug. In that hug, I felt a sense of protection and understanding that I hadn't felt since Frank was alive. As I watched her walk out the door and disappear behind the trees, I realized I didn't feel like this house was a dungeon anymore. I reached into my pocket and touched the sharp edge of that little piece of paper. It felt like holding a master key to my own life. Colin might not believe me, and Karen might try to lock me away, but I finally had an ally. I looked up at the empty space on the wall, where Frank's picture used to hang, and I made a promise to him. I promised I wouldn't let them erase us. That night, I ate every bite of Karen's bland soup. I didn't eat it because it was good. I ate it because I needed the strength to start the journey of finding myself again. Anna's small slip of paper was tucked deep into the pocket of my cardigan, pressed against my side like a warm, living thing. It wasn't just a series of numbers scribbled in haste. It was a lifeline thrown into a vast, dark ocean of lies. After Anna left that afternoon, the house settled back into its usual, suffocating silence, but this time, the quiet didn't make me feel like I was drowning. I sat there in the fading light of the living room, listening to the heavy, rhythmic sound of Karen's footsteps as she moved about on the floor above me. For the first time in months, I wasn't just waiting for the next blow or the next insult. I was thinking. I was calculating. I was starting to map out a way back to the woman I used to be. Later that evening, Karen came into my room. She closed the door behind her with a soft, ominous click and wore that same cold, thin smile she only showed when we were alone. She didn't need to play the part of the saintly caregiver when Colin wasn't around to watch. She sat on the edge of my bed and told me that even Anna could see how tired and confused I was becoming. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, jagged whisper, and told me that if I kept having these forgetful episodes and telling wild stories about Michael being in Italy, she would have to talk to Colin about finding a more professional place for me. She spoke about a nursing home on the outskirts of town, a place where I would finally get the real rest I supposedly needed. The primal fear of being sent away and losing every ounce of my freedom flashed through my mind like a lightning strike. Every senior in this country knows what that threat means. But as I looked into her eyes, I realized she could only use that fear against me if I stayed afraid. I forced myself to nod, lowering my gaze and pretending to submit. I told her I understood and that I would try to be more mindful. The next morning offered the perfect window of opportunity. Karen headed out to do some high-end shopping at Whole Foods, and Colin had long since left for his office in the city. As soon as the garage door finished its heavy rumble, I reached for the Amazon Kindle that Frank had bought for me last year. Karen always looked at it like it was some prehistoric piece of technology, a simple electronic book that she didn't think twice about. She had no idea that it had a basic web browser and that I had long ago synced it to my personal accounts. My hands were shaking as I pulled up the log-in pages for my bank and the Social Security portal, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I saw the numbers. I saw the steady, calculated withdrawals of my pension money, used for expenses I had never authorized and things I had never seen. A hot, sharp anger flared up in my chest, and it gave me the focus I needed. I took my first real step toward safety. I changed the delivery address for all my bank statements and legal notices from this house to Anna's private P.O. box at the church. Then, I changed my access passwords to a sequence only Michael and I would ever know, the date of Frank's birthday. With that done, I moved to the landline in the kitchen. I didn't call Michael directly, knowing I couldn't risk a long conversation just yet. Instead, I dialed the number for the church's legal aid office that Anna had mentioned. The voice on the other end belonged to an older gentleman, a lawyer whose calm, steady tone immediately settled the fluttering in my stomach. I spoke quickly but clearly, telling him about the forced isolation, the way my money was being handled, and the dark bruise still blooming on my arm. He listened without interrupting, his silence giving me the space to finally speak my truth to someone who could actually do something about it. He told me I was being very brave and instructed me on how to gather evidence quietly without raising suspicion. He told me to keep things as normal as possible until Michael could make it home. When I hung up, I made sure to clear the caller ID with hands that were no longer trembling. I felt a sudden, powerful surge of energy through my spine. I wasn't a helpless old woman waiting for a handout anymore. I was back in the driver's seat of my own life. When Karen finally returned, her arms full of designer shopping bags tucked inside her grocery totes, she found me sitting peacefully by the window. I had my Kindle in my hand, looking for all the world like I was lost in the pages of a comforting novel. She had no idea that behind that quiet exterior, I was building a fortress. I looked down at my old Skechers and felt the solid weight of the floor beneath me. I had reclaimed control of my own future, and more importantly, I had reclaimed my belief in myself. That night, for the first time in a very long time, I slept a deep and dreamless sleep. I didn't have nightmares about being locked away in a nursing home because I knew, deep down, that the wheels of justice were finally starting to turn. Seeing Rayleigh take that brave first step warms my heart. Freedom isn't always loud. It's often a quiet choice made in the dark. Her use of an old e-reader shows the wisdom we gain with age. Do financial control and tech skills protect us as we grow older? Share your story. Your words may help someone find courage today. The air inside our North Carolina home grew thick and heavy, like the breathless moments before a tropical storm hits the coast. I sat by the window, my fingers tracing the soft wool of my cardigan, watching the world outside with a quiet, newfound clarity. Karen was moving about the house as she usually did, her laughter echoing through the halls, trailing that sharp, heavy scent of Chanel perfume she had brought back from her secret getaway. She had no idea that the mailbox at the end of the driveway, the very one she used to raid for my bank statements and pension checks, was going to be empty today. That emptiness was a signal, a silent gong announcing the beginning of her downfall. Later that afternoon, the aggressive screech of tires on the driveway told me she was back. I heard the metallic clang of the mailbox being snapped open and shut. A few minutes later, Karen burst through the front door. The face that was usually so carefully painted with layers of makeup was now contorted with a raw, ugly rage. She didn't even bother with the facade of the loving daughter-in-law anymore. She stormed straight into my room, her eyes wide and frantic. She demanded to know where my pension statements were and why the supplemental Medicare checks hadn't arrived. She yelled, asking me why the post office had told her that my mailing address had been changed. I stayed perfectly still in my chair, feeling a cold current of electricity running through me, but my mind was sharper than a razor. I looked her right in those bloodshot eyes and told her that maybe the post office had just made a mistake. Or perhaps, I suggested, they had noticed that someone was using my money for things that weren't right and decided to secure my accounts. Karen hissed at me, leaning in so close I could smell the sharp tang of red wine on her breath. She called me a senile old woman and asked if I was trying to cut off the family's lifeline, blaming the rising costs of inflation for the stress Colin was under. Right then, Colin walked through the door. He looked more exhausted than I had ever seen him, his work suit wrinkled and his shoulders slumped. When he saw Karen screaming in my face, he frowned and asked her what on earth was going on. Karen's expression shifted in the blink of an eye. She started sobbing, clinging to Colin's arm like a helpless victim. She told him that I was doing it again, claiming I had cut off all the household payments because I didn't trust them anymore. She cried about how she had been sacrificing everything and going without just to take care of me. Seeing my son so confused and torn made my heart ache, but I knew I couldn't let her win this time. I spoke up, my voice sounding incredibly calm and steady. I asked Colin if he knew about the $5,000 gold bracelet Karen had hidden in her jewelry drawer, the one engraved with the words 2K from Naples. Karen's face went deathly pale in an instant. Colin looked at his wife, then back at me, a flicker of suspicion finally lighting up in his tired eyes. He asked her what bracelet I was talking about and why I was mentioning Naples when she was supposed to be at home nursing me back to health. Karen started stammering, telling him I was just dreaming again and that the medication was giving me hallucinations. But I was ready for her. I reached under my pillow and pulled out a stack of photos that Anna had helped me print from Michael's emails. They were clear, high-resolution shots of Karen smiling as she stepped out of a luxury jewelry boutique in Italy, arm in arm with an older man who certainly wasn't my son. I handed the photos to Colin. His hands were shaking as he took them. I watched as he looked through them one by one, each image acting like a physical blow to the blindness he had lived in for so long. He looked at Karen with a mixture of pure disgust and absolute heartbreak. Knowing she was cornered, Karen suddenly dropped the act completely. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh that sounded like glass breaking. She admitted everything, asking him what he expected, living in a crumbling old house with a workaholic husband and a decaying old woman. She told him it was boring and that she deserved to live and enjoy herself. She claimed the money she took from me was just compensation for the years of her youth she had wasted on us. She lunged forward, trying to grab the photos from Colin's hand, but he shoved her away. She lost her balance and tumbled back into the expensive, modern furniture she had bought with my stolen savings. In a total frenzy, she started screaming and cursing at both of us, using words I didn't even know she knew. At the height of the chaos, the landline on the wall began to ring. I reached over and hit the speakerphone. It was Michael. His voice came through the speaker loud and commanding. He told Colin he was standing at the Charlotte airport right then and that he had the detailed bank records our lawyer had pulled. He revealed that Karen had drained over $40,000 from my accounts in just 6 months to pay for her luxury trips and expensive gifts. He added that the police were already looking into several suspicious transactions made in her name. The room fell into a deathly silence. Karen sat slumped on the floor, her hair a mess, no longer looking like the sophisticated North Carolina lady she pretended to be. Colin just stood there, paralyzed by the truth that he had been harboring a snake, allowing his own wife to abuse his mother for the sake of a fake, hollow lifestyle. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling a 1,000-pound weight finally lift from my chest. Justice doesn't always have to be a bloody battle. Sometimes, it is as simple as letting the truth speak for itself. I looked out at the garden, where the autumn leaves were turning a deep, beautiful red, and I knew that the darkest winter of my life had finally come to an end. The next morning, I woke up to something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Absolute, unhurried peace. There was no blaring television from the living room, no sharp, impatient footsteps echoing in the hallway, and no heavy scent of Chanel perfume clinging to the air like a warning. Instead, there was only the gentle warmth of a single sunbeam that had found its way through a gap in the curtains to rest against my cheek. The house was so quiet that I could hear the faint, cheerful song of a cardinal perched on the porch railing outside. Karen was gone, forced by Colin to move into a temporary apartment while the legal proceedings began, and Colin himself was at the airport, waiting for Michael's plane to touch down. For the first time in months, my chest felt light, as if a crushing stone had finally dissolved into mist. I took my time getting out of bed, enjoying the simple freedom of movement. I walked through the living room and began opening every single window, letting the crisp, clean North Carolina air flood into the house. I wanted it to sweep away the stale energy of those long, dark days of isolation. I felt a sudden urge to reclaim the spaces that had been taken from me. I made my way to the attic, a place I hadn't been allowed to enter for nearly a year. With Anna's help later that morning, I found what I was looking for: the dusty box labeled Memories. My fingers trembled as I pulled out the old black and white wedding photo of Frank and me. I took a soft silk cloth and carefully wiped away the thin layer of dust from the glass. Then I carried it back to my bedroom and placed it in its rightful spot on my nightstand. I looked at his kind, steady smile and felt a lump form in my throat. But this time it wasn't from sorrow. I whispered to him that I was back and that our home was finally clean again. A deep sense of belonging washed over me, warming the room that had felt so cold for so long. In the afternoon, Anna came by with a small bag of rose seeds and a basket of fresh peaches. We went out to the backyard together. I pulled on my old, stained gardening gloves and knelt in the dirt, feeling the cool, moist earth between my fingers. There is something profoundly healing about touching the soil, about participating in the cycle of life that refuses to be stifled. We didn't talk about Karen, and we didn't mention the bruises on my arm that had faded to a faint, sickly yellow. We talked about the weather, the upcoming book club meeting at the church, and the list of library books I wanted to borrow next week. I realized then that healing isn't about forgetting the pain. It's about choosing to bloom in spite of it. As the sun began to dip behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, I sat on my porch with a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea. I wasn't staring at my phone in a state of hopeless waiting anymore. I knew Michael was on his way, and I knew that Colin, though still burdened by his own guilt, was finally learning how to truly listen to his mother. I opened my Kindle, not to hide from the world, but to truly enjoy the quiet thrill of a new story. I felt stronger and clearer than I ever had before. I wasn't the senile old woman in someone else's twisted script. I was Rayleigh, the woman who had fought for her home and her dignity. It was a simple kind of freedom, but it was the most precious thing I had ever owned. The rain in North Carolina this afternoon fell in a steady, heavy downpour, the kind that turns the red clay soil into a thick slurry and makes the trees bow their heads in surrender. I sat in the living room, nestled into the worn fabric of the armchair that Frank used to love more than any other piece of furniture in the house. In my hands, I held a mug of hot cinnamon and orange tea, the steam rising in gentle curls that mimicked the gray mist outside the window. The stillness of the house no longer felt like the hollow, terrifying isolation of a prison. Instead, it was a quiet, hard-won peace, a silence that I had fought for with every ounce of strength I had left. But even as I watched the raindrops race down the glass, I knew the storm hadn't fully passed. I heard the familiar hum of an engine pulling up to the gate, the tires crunching against the wet gravel, and I knew deep down that Karen had returned for her final act. The front door swung open with a suddenness that made the air in the room shift. Karen stepped inside, but she was unrecognizable from the polished, designer-clad woman who had flaunted her jewelry in Naples. She looked intentionally disheveled, her hair damp and tangled from the rain, her eyes swollen and red, as if she had been crying for hours. It was a perfectly staged image, a desperate attempt to claw back some shred of pity. Colin and Michael were already standing there, positioned like two solid pillars on either side of my chair, a silent guard that I had never expected to have again. Karen didn't even look at them. She made a beeline for me, collapsing to her knees on the rug at my feet. The very hands that had once dug their nails into my skin were now trembling as they clutched at the hem of my skirt. She began to sob, her voice cracking as she begged me for forgiveness. She claimed she had been led astray, that the pressure of the economy and our finances had clouded her judgment. She pleaded with me to think of the grandchildren and the years we had spent as a family. She told me that if I went through with the legal action, she would lose everything. And she asked how I could live with myself knowing I was taking a mother away from her children. It was her final, most calculated psychological attack, aiming straight for the one thing she thought would break me: my love for my grandkids. This is the last card a person like her plays, using the innocent as a shield for their own cruelty. She looked over at Colin, hoping to find that spark of hesitation or weakness she had exploited for so long. She asked him to say something, reminding him that she was still his wife. But Colin remained silent, his face set like stone. He looked down at the woman who had deceived him and mistreated his mother with a cold, clear-eyed recognition. He reached out and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, a simple gesture that told me the power was entirely in my hands now. He was finally standing back and letting me speak my own truth. I set my tea down on the wooden side table, the soft clink of the ceramic against the wood sounding final and sharp in the quiet room. I looked Karen directly in the eyes, and for the first time, I felt no fear and no flicker of uncertainty. My voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried a weight that made her sobbing stop instantly. I told her that she was not a victim in this story. I told her she had been given 1,000 chances to do the right thing, and that she chose to use my life savings to fund a secret life of luxury while telling her husband I was dying. I reminded her of how she had locked me in my own home and used physical force the moment I began to uncover the truth. I reached into the side table drawer and pulled out a thick blue envelope from our lawyer's office. I told her it contained a temporary restraining order and the initial terms for a divorce settlement that Colin's legal team had drafted. I told her I didn't want to use a word like retribution, but I did demand fairness. I told her she would either find a way to return the money she had taken, or we would see each other in a county courtroom where every piece of evidence of her elder abuse would be laid bare for the world to see. Karen opened her mouth to scream, to lash out one last time, but Michael stepped forward and placed a heavy folder on the table next to my tea. He told her that every transaction from my accounts in Italy had been verified, and that every jewelry receipt had been tracked down. He mentioned the written statements from Anna and the doctor regarding the bruises on my arms. He told her there was no longer a path back for her. The mask finally shattered. Karen's face transformed from a portrait of sorrow to a mask of cold, concentrated hatred. She stood up abruptly, her eyes darting around the room as if she were looking for one last thing to break. She looked like she wanted to curse me, but the steady, unyielding look in my eyes stopped her cold. I told her that she was wrong to think that the silence of the elderly is a sign of weakness. I told her we are often silent because we love, but when that love is betrayed, that same silence becomes the strength we need to protect the truth. I told her to go and never come back to this house again. Karen grabbed her bag and stormed out of the house into the white wall of rain without another word. The sound of her car speeding away tore through the afternoon before the silence of the countryside settled back over us. Colin sat down on the edge of the sofa next to me and took my hand, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He apologized for being so blind for so long, his voice barely a whisper. I squeezed his hand and looked over at Michael, who was leaning against the doorframe with a small, relieved smile. The rain outside began to let up, the clouds thinning just enough for a pale, watery rainbow to stretch across the horizon. As I sat there with my sons, I realized that the house didn't just feel like a building anymore. It felt like home. Watching Rayleigh stand her ground with calm strength is inspiring. Her story reminds us that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting harm. True healing can mean setting firm boundaries to protect our dignity. What do you think of her choice? Would you do the same? Please share your thoughts. Your words may help someone else find courage. After the stormy afternoon of facing Karen, the house seemed to stretch out, becoming wider and brighter than it had been in years. As the sound of her car faded into the distance, I realized that my life was no longer being squeezed by a toxic hand, but was instead being held by something much stronger: the protective embrace of the law and the simple weight of what is right. I sat back down at the kitchen table, watching Michael as he organized the thick stacks of documents he had brought. For the first time in a very long time, I could feel my lungs expand fully, taking a deep breath without that familiar, jagged fear of my chest tightening in panic. On Monday morning, a white car with the county government seal pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a woman named Sarah, a social worker from Adult Protective Services whom Anna had helped me contact. Sarah had a kind, motherly face and a voice that was so steady and calm it felt like an anchor in a rough sea. She didn't look at me with the pitying eyes I had come to expect from Karen. She looked at me as a citizen, a person with rights that deserved to be enforced. We sat in the living room, and Sarah carefully took notes as I told her everything. She took photographs of the fading yellow bruises on my arm, the last physical remnants of Karen's cruelty. Sarah looked me in the eye and told me with absolute certainty that in the state of North Carolina, elder abuse is a serious crime. She told me I had done the right thing by speaking up, and promised that her office would work closely with my son's lawyers to ensure my absolute safety. Hearing an official voice validate my pain was a healing medicine I didn't even know I needed. The days that followed were busy, but they were filled with a new kind of hope rather than the old exhaustion. Michael drove me to the notary office in the center of town. There, with the support of a specialized attorney, We went through the formal process of revoking the power of attorney I had foolishly signed over to Karen months ago. It felt like physically cutting the chains that had bound me to her. Every point of access to my bank accounts and credit cards was shut down and replaced with a new, secure system that only Michael and I could manage. Holding that new savings book and the house title in my own hands, seeing my name as the sole owner without a manipulator lurking in the shadows, made me feel like the master of my own life once again. My lawyer explained that they were already moving to seek financial restitution for the $40,000 Karen had stolen during the divorce proceedings. Justice, I realized, wasn't about getting even or seeking revenge. It was about putting every piece of my life back where it belonged. Colin had changed more than I ever thought possible. He stopped burying his head in his work as a way to hide from the mess at home. In the evenings, he would sit with me at the table, helping me go over the household bills and explaining the new security measures. He took it upon himself to remove the flashy, cold furniture Karen had bought with my money, replacing the space with the simple, cozy things I had always loved. He sat me down one night, his voice thick with a sincere, heavy regret, and told me he was so sorry for leaving me to suffer alone. He promised to do everything in his power to make it up to me. He signed the divorce papers without a second of hesitation, using the evidence Michael had gathered regarding the infidelity and the abuse. Seeing my son grow and take responsibility like this told me that while our hearts still had scars, we were finally building a real foundation for our family again. Justice also came in the smallest, most quiet ways. I received a phone call from my bank, where a manager personally apologized for allowing the suspicious transactions to go unnoticed and promised to tighten the security on my accounts. The ladies at the church sent over a beautiful basket of fresh flowers with a card telling me how much they missed me and how glad they were that I was back. I stood in front of the mirror in my hallway today, adjusting my collar and looking at the 68-year-old woman staring back at me. My eyes didn't hold that haunted look of fear anymore. Instead, there was a quiet, steady resolve. I had reclaimed my dignity not through anger, but through the truth and a stubborn kind of persistence. The American legal system, the dedication of people like Sarah, and the fierce love of my two sons had woven a strong safety net around me. I was no longer a victim of neglect or a woman forgotten in the shadows of her own house. I was a woman who was protected, respected, and finally, truly free. After days of preparing the mountains of paperwork with Michael and our legal team, the morning I had been waiting for finally arrived. I stood in front of the hallway mirror, carefully tying the silk scarf that Frank had given me on our 40th anniversary. I made a conscious choice not to wear black, which felt too much like mourning. Instead, I chose a soft blue silk blouse, a color that felt like the morning sky after a long, rainy night. It felt like hope. As I stepped out of the house, my feet felt remarkably steady in my old Skechers. I didn't reach for the wooden cane that Karen had hidden away from me because I didn't need it anymore. Today, the law was going to be my support, a foundation far more solid than any piece of wood could ever be. I looked up at the towering oaks of North Carolina as we drove, their leaves shimmering with the last gold of autumn, and I knew that whatever happened in that room, I had already found my voice again. The county courthouse appeared on the horizon, its grand white stone columns standing like silent sentinels of truth. Michael held my hand tightly as we walked through the security checkpoint, his presence a warm and constant reminder that I was no longer alone. Colin walked a few steps behind us, his face pale and somber, but his eyes held a new kind of iron resolve that I hadn't seen in years. Across the wide hallway, I saw Karen standing with her lawyer. she was still trying to play the part, wearing a simple, modest dress and keeping her head bowed as if she were the one who had been wronged. But I noticed the way her hands were trembling as she gripped her expensive leather handbag, and I saw the flicker of genuine fear in her eyes when she caught me looking at her. She wasn't the powerful jailer anymore. She was just a woman caught in the web of her own lies. We walked into the courtroom, and the atmosphere was heavy with the smell of old oak and stacks of legal paper. When the judge entered the room and the bailiff called us to order, I felt a strange surge of energy run through me. This was no longer a quiet argument in my kitchen or a whispered threat in the dark of my bedroom. This was a place where the truth was sacred, where everything would be weighed on the scales of justice. I sat at the table with my lawyer, my heart beating with a steady, calm rhythm. I felt Frank's presence beside me, as if he were whispering that I had done enough, that it was time to let the world see what had been done to us. The proceedings began with my lawyer presenting the evidence we had gathered. One by one, the photographs of the bruises on my arms were projected onto the large screen at the front of the room. They looked even more horrific in the harsh light of the court, an undeniable map of the physical toll Karen's control had taken on my body. Then came the numbers. The detailed bank statements were laid out, showing exactly how my meager pension had been siphoned away to pay for luxury hotel stays in Italy, designer jewelry, and expensive dinners I never knew about. The contrast between my life of forced austerity and her life of secret decadence was staggering. The most powerful moments came when Anna and Sarah from Adult Protective Services stood to give their testimonies. They spoke clearly about the systematic isolation I had endured, the way I had been kept from my friends, and the calculated way my autonomy had been stripped from me under the guise of medical necessity. Karen sat there, her face shifting from a sickly pale to a deep, burning red of humiliation as the mask she had worn for years was systematically torn away. Her lawyer tried to argue that I was suffering from age-related memory loss and that Karen was simply managing the household for a confused relative. But the evidence was far too heavy for that lie to hold any weight. Then, it was my turn to take the witness stand. The judge looked at me over his spectacles, his eyes sharp and analytical, but filled with a surprising amount of empathy. He asked me a very simple question, wanting to know if I understood exactly what was happening in his courtroom that day. I looked directly at him, making sure my voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. I told him that I understood better than I had in years. I told him that I had spent my entire life working to build my home and save for my future. I told him I knew exactly where every cent of my pension was supposed to go, and I knew exactly whose hands had caused the marks on my skin. I said that while my age might have slowed my steps, it had not dimmed my mind or erased my dignity. I told the court that I wasn't there to seek revenge, but to reclaim my right to be a whole person in the years I had left. The silence that followed my words was absolute. I saw Colin bow his head, his shoulders shaking as he finally confronted the full weight of his silence. Michael looked at me with a pride that made my heart swell. The judge didn't take long to reach his decision. The sound of his gavel hitting the wood was like a thunderclap, signaling the end of my long winter. He declared that Karen had violated the state laws regarding elder abuse and financial exploitation. He ordered her to make full restitution for every dollar she had taken from my accounts. A permanent protective order was established, forbidding her from coming anywhere near me or the property ever again. But the most important part of the ruling was the judge's formal declaration that I was of sound mind and possessed the absolute right to manage my own finances and my own life. Regarding Colin, The divorce was granted based on the undeniable evidence of Karen's infidelity and her abusive conduct. She was ordered to vacate the house and was stripped of any claim to the property or the assets that had been built on my sacrifices. When we finally walked out of those courthouse doors, the late afternoon sun was glowing a brilliant, fiery orange over the North Carolina hills. I stood at the top of the stone steps and took a long, deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of fresh rain and cut grass. I felt a sense of freedom that was so intense it felt like I was floating. Karen hurried away from the crowd, disappearing into the traffic and leaving behind nothing but the ashes of the life she had tried to steal. Michael wrapped his arm around me, and Colin took my other hand, leaning in to tell me that it was finally time to go to our real home. I looked up at the endless blue sky and smiled. I was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. I was Rayleigh, the woman who had written her own ending. My liberation didn't come from the piece of paper the judge had signed. It came from the moment I decided that I was still here, and that I still mattered. 6 months have passed since that day in the courtroom, and North Carolina is now breathing in the full, vibrant colors of spring. I am sitting on my porch, the soft soles of my Skechers tapping a gentle rhythm against the wood as my armchair sways. There is no longer the metallic, cold click of a lock to tell me I am a prisoner. Instead, there is only the sound of a warm breeze moving through the lush green maple leaves and the sweet, unmistakable scent of freedom in full bloom. In the garden, the rose bushes that Anna and I planted during those uncertain days are finally showing their first buds. Michael is busy at the grill, the rich, smoky aroma of BBQ chicken drifting through the air. A small, traditional family gathering that feels more sacred than any holiday. Colin is sitting on the grass nearby, patiently helping the grandkids fix an old bicycle. Every now and then, he looks up at me and catches my eye with a soft, sincere smile, a connection I once feared was lost to the shadows forever. Anna arrives with a warm, homemade apple pie and sits beside me, taking my hand in hers. My skin is clear now, the bruises long gone, and we don't need to say much to understand the peace we found. I realize now that family isn't just about the blood we share. It is about the people who see your pain and choose to stand beside you while you heal it. I look at my house, the home Frank and I built with our own hands and hearts. It isn't cold or hollow anymore. And there are no flashy, expensive things hiding a rotten core. It is filled with laughter, genuine love, and a quiet, steady respect. I am no longer afraid of getting older because I know that I have value, I have a voice, and I have people who truly cherish me. My life, from this moment on, belongs to me. My dear friends, Rayleigh's journey ends here, but I believe the echoes of her strength will stay with us for a long time. As I write these final words, I feel a sense of profound happiness because truth has finally won and a soul has found its way back to the light. This story serves as a reminder for all of us, especially for women in their golden years. Silence is never the price we should pay for love. And setting personal boundaries is the highest form of self-respect. You have every right to be safe, to be respected, and to be the master of your own life, no matter your age. Never let anyone use the name of family to take the light out of your eyes. I would love to know how you feel after hearing this journey. Is there an image or a word that touched your heart the most? Or is there a lesson you want to tell your future self 10 years from now? Please leave a comment and share your thoughts with me. Your stories are the greatest gift I could receive. I am Casey, wishing you peace in your own home until we meet again.